American antebellum slavery today. We're going to talk about the development of slavery more from the slave's point of view. We got some good information about the American antebellum South in a previous lecture, but now we're going to talk about not only the history of how we assessed slavery, the history of slavery, but also get into some of the details about a life of slaves and how the institution changed, especially in this time period from 1820 to 1860. So our story begins in the time right after the American Revolution, where we had the first census of slaves in the United States. So it goes to about 1776, where we know there were 700,000 slaves in the 1790 census. And that changed, which was the first census. I mean, from 1770s up until 1860, slavery itself became more confined in the South, but it also grew. It expanded rapidly in the place where it continued to exist, and that is, for the most part, the American South. Whether or not it would expand into areas of the West was one of the critical issues from 1820 until the onset of the Civil War. So once again, the numbers, by the pure numbers. The first census of the United States counts 700,000 slaves. In 1860, that number has grown to 4 million. So we see a rapid population growth and we see a geographic growth throughout different parts of the United States. And I will say that probably in the last 5 or so decades, we've begun to examine, fortunately, the life of slaves in more detail, because for the most part, up to that point, we look at slavery from the view of the owner, the slave holding or the slave owning class. And so the early stories of slavery, the history of this subject, usually treated slavery as a benign and not a completely harmful institution put upon by Africans and African Americans. Others portray slavery as a total domination. So there we have the two interpretations of what slavery does to the human being. Ulrich Phillips, one of the first authors writing about the subject of slavery, called the plantation, quote, a school constantly training and controlling pupils who were in a backward state of civilization, unquote. So this obviously was written in a time where thoughts of racial equality within the United States, the 1920s and 30s, again, were a heck of a lot different than they are today. So people, as I've said before, and that you should be familiar with the idea that historians are, in many cases, products of the times that they lived through. In this case, we had the Jim Crow South. We had segregation, which was still in force in the aftermath of World War I, a movement of African Americans to the northern cities known as the Great Migration. And so you have this statement, which today would and should horrify us, constantly training pupils who are in a backward state of civilization. Now, I don't think the author meant it in terms of being particularly harmful, but I think that statement applies to what he thought was the totality of slavery itself. And so at least we begin to see a change in evaluating slavery from the slave's point of view. Mostly it was about how planters managed slaves, but finally we begin to change the perspective. And again, that happens in the last 50 or so years. There's an overwhelming sense, even as we get into the 1950s, of treating slaves as objects. That's what most history books do from the 1920s to the 1950s. Things were done to the slaves. They had no agency in their own lives, in other words. They couldn't control anything. Slavery was a fairly total institution. What did Ulrich Phillips say? A training and controlling of pupils. It's going to go on from there. And the divide in the historical community will be in the 1960s about whether this system was ever able to exert total control. So in 1958, we see a book that begins to change the tone of how we talk about slavery. This book is by Kenneth Stamp, 1958, and it's called The Peculiar Institution, Slavery in the Antebellum South. The book is about the treatment of slaves. The shortcoming of the book is that it is more revealing about slave owners, I would say. It tells you about the slave holder class, the slave owning class, than the slaves. And that all has to do with the sources that Kenneth Stamp used in putting together this book. It was the slave owner's point of view. But it's changing nevertheless. There was an attempt, at least from the slave owner's point of view, to consider slaves in the story of slavery. Now, were they using slave sources? Not so much. Slaves as victims reached their peak with a book that was published the next year, 1959. This is Stanley Elkins's Slavery. Slavery talked about a complete and total closed environment of the system. And the subtitle of the book is The Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life. Slaves and the system of slavery, and we might say what slavery did to slaves, was put them in an effectively an infantilized state. And he came up in his book with what was called the Sambo thesis. Slaves were reduced by the brutality of the system of slavery to a childlike status. They were dependent, completely unable outside the system of slavery to function on their own. He was making comparisons in the total system of slavery with what had happened in the past during the Germans' final solution. Obviously, the Holocaust we're talking about, killing of 6 million Jews and others that they deemed non-desirables. This was a groundbreaking work, Elkins's Slavery. Now, the book is still around. It is controversial to the point of being disproven for the most part. But analyzing in a form, we might call interdisciplinary form, psychohistory. It is taking the psychology of slaves. And though his thesis is not and has not held up in the 60 or so years since the book was actually published, disproving the book is just as important as the thesis. If it's flawed, he put it forward. And in that thesis, he did something very important for the study of slavery. He talked about the issue of slave culture from the slave's point of view. Again, people immediately disproved some of the things he said, or the so-called Sambo thesis. If slaves were completely childlike and docile, how do you account for the short period of time where African Americans, once freed and, again, slavery ended, participating, in at least for a short time, in trying to form governments in the South, and getting elected to office, going out and trying to become economically independent in the aftermath of the devastation of slavery. So by the 1970s, again, the book makes a splash sometimes for the fact that it's flawed, because people attack the book and say, look, this is the reality of the mindset of slaves. It is not as total as Elkins wants to make it appear, which is good, because the end result is you have more people writing about the subject. So a couple decades after the book is written, this Sambo thesis is in tatters. But others want to refute it, and that's important. And that's why you have, again, texts that challenge what Elkins said. New sources also shift the narrative back to slaves themselves, and they had been around for a while. In the 1950s, historians started looking at archaeological remains, again, with that idea of interdisciplinary studies. They also looked at what are called the WPA, the Work Progress Administration, slave narratives, and these provide rich explanations. This is a cover photo of a collection of WPA narratives. Now, what was done in the 1930s, this is during the Great Depression, during the New Deal, To give folks jobs, the government, among other things, were dedicating and building national parks. They were building cabins in places like central Arkansas. You can still see WCPA or CCC cabins. Other writers were going out and writing travel narratives about the United States, and others were gathering information from those who had survived slavery. Because people said, yeah, the real sources here are getting old and dying out. And so why not take their account? And so that's why we get the WPA slave narratives. It's very critical to have these sources. Now, for the first time, the slave's vantage point is, of course, all important to the discussion of the institution of slavery. And so these were taken down and used, and they became sources in writing about slavery from the 1960s onward. Two trends emerge in antebellum slavery. Two overriding trends that we see from slave owners and how they hope to treat slaves and the development of slavery from 1820 to 1860. Masters were expressing growing concern about their system under attack. So slave owners renewed a lot of the efforts to promote slave dependence and to create a total system, control the institution. New efforts to control slavery were put in place. The other trend was that they restricted the actions of both slaves and free people of color. Said differently, stopping manumissions, or owners being allowed to free their slaves, or prevent a growing free people of color population in a given state, which would, of course, undermine their theories on race, their theories on slavery itself, and to compare their system favorably with what was developing in the North, specifically people working wages, and comparing slavery favorable to that. The slave system included state laws that were designed to limit the power of masters. But like a lot that we say about slavery today, there is no one system of slavery, there is no one type of master, and there is, we can say, inconsistent enforcement. Slaves typically, in state laws, were protected from being murdered and mutilated. But how this is patrolled in outlying areas is anyone's business. This is the duality of slavery and the problem of slavery. Really the central theme of this class, we can say. How do you dehumanize human beings? How do you reduce people to property and then pass laws that say, well, they're not simply property. They are human beings with their own agency and ability to try to free themselves, to resist, to start families, to marry, to practice their faith. Again, the problem of slavery. States also started to put in place in the antebellum period minimal standards for food, clothing, and shelter, while at the same time keeping control of the institution. Monitoring where slaves were traveling, preventing them from, in some cases, learning to read, definitely from owning guns or acquiring guns. The codes in the states acknowledge that bondsmen, men and women and children who were enslaved, were human. They can plot, they can steal, they can rebel, they can flee. But at the same time, they wanted to keep the system in check by saying that slave is a piece of property. They cannot marry in any southern state. Slave marriages happen, they're just not legal. They cannot hold property, and they are not allowed to testify in courts in the South. It seems contradictory, and it is absolutely contradictory. As Southern whites grow more and more committed to slavery and to this system of slavery, they find ways to defend it. So it kind of creates, I think we can say, an illusion. Demonstrates the Southerners are demonstrating to themselves and outsiders a humaneness of slavery as they try to dehumanize slaves into simple collections of property, and they were never, of course, able to do that. Antebellum slavery is a heterogeneous institution, meaning to say the typical slave owner or slave or farm or plantation just doesn't apply. Slaves face a wide variety of conditions depending on what part of the United States that we're talking about. Some lived on plantations. They toiled under the eyes of a driver or an overseer. Others worked besides owners. They had contact with their master, and it depended on the circumstances. That probably is the most frequent occurrence of slavery that you would see, owners and slaves working in the same field at the same task. A few slaves in South Carolina and Louisiana actually owned other slaves. We also know there are accounts of Native Americans owning slaves. The Cherokee Nation owned slaves in the 1830s as they tried to become more like whites and live amongst whites, which ultimately didn't work. Slaves on plantations and farms served a number of different purposes and had a number of different jobs. They were preachers, they just weren't field hands. This is a sugar plantation. We'll talk about some of the circumstances where slaves worked and how they worked. But I think you have to keep something in mind, that on farms and plantations, owners would want to become totally independent and be able to make or produce things right there on their own property. And so they trained slaves. So they were blacksmiths, they were cooks, they were house servants. Owners employed blacks as drivers. One slave would organize work crews for the day. And they worked in a number of different things that had to be done in the course of a day on a farm or plantation. You grew everything from sugarcane, cotton, rice, tobacco, wheat, corn, hemp. Slaves were engaged mostly in agricultural tasks, but there are others as well, some of which I talked about. Slaves also lived in American antebellum cities. They lived a lifestyle that was very, very different from a typical field hand. Urban slaves, a small part of the population, nevertheless, did exist, and they didn't do the same things that slaves who worked in large plantations and holdings did. So there is no one slavery that encompasses all slaves and masters. Oftentimes location mattered. A slave who worked a large cotton plantation in Mississippi has a different experience than one in Kentucky growing hemp. What type of climate or weather, how many slaves you were around, whether it be a large property owner of slaves, or you might be one or two slaves owned by someone who was trying to be upwardly mobile and go from owning 2 slaves to 5. That certainly was the ambition of people in the South. And that slave who worked growing hemp in Kentucky would have a different experience than a slave who worked in New Orleans or Baltimore, those in urban settings. But what you have to remember about slavery, the institution of slavery, is that it is never an invisible institution. Slaves account for 1/3 of the population of the South. So you saw slaves in different capacities, whether you be in a city or in outlying areas. But the difference in the slave population is often dramatic. In Delaware, 1.6 of the population, 1.6%, just under 2%, was enslaved. In South Carolina, that number is 57%. So we go from about 2% in Delaware, where you could number the slaves in the hundreds on the eve of the Civil War, to South Carolina, where nearly 60%. An African-American majority, had been an African-American majority ever since the 1690s. Another misconception about slavery is how many large slave owners actually exist. This is a chart that I found, or more specifically, how many people in the South owned slaves. Only about 3% of Southern slave holders owned more than 50 slaves. The Gone with the Wind Oak Alley going to the big house is an exception to the rule. Let's look at this chart in some detail. 75% of white Southerners do not own slaves. That means only 25% of Southern families own slaves. It is a slave-holding minority. Of that 25%, of the total of those who own slaves, 0.5% own more than 50. So you can see in this graph, if we look at the three most prevalent numbers of slaves, it's those that owned 1, a group of 2 to 4, or 5 to 9. So add that all up. It's 6, 8, and 5% altogether. That gives you an idea about the fact that slavery was a minority of the Southern population, and those that owned a lot of slaves were a minority within that group. Now, it doesn't mean that extreme concentrations of slave ownership did not exist, because it did. Coastal South Carolina would be one example, working the large indigo and rice plantations ever since colonial times. Georgia, you can see similar concentrations along what we would today call the Low Country. Parts of lower Louisiana, in fact, Ascension Parish. We know that 1/2 the slaves in Ascension Parish lived on plantations of 175 slaves or more. Rare, but when it did happen, it happened in some concentrated areas. That, however, 175 slaves by one owner in one plantation. It's pretty atypical. Half of Southern slaves lived in holdings of 10 to 49. So there you go. That gives you some idea of what we're talking about. Most slaves were field hands. They worked, and their work was divided into two distinct groups. They had the gang system, and they had the task system. It often depended on what task we were talking about, where slaves worked. Gang work usually involved concentrated labor on one particular job. Think of the slide working, in this case, cotton. It would be the gang labor. Time to harvest, whether it be cotton, whether it be sugar, as the other slide showed. There was also the task system, where multiple jobs would be given to a particular slave or groups of slaves during a day. Cutting wood, clearing a field, fetching water. That would be the task system. You can expect to do both or one. It all depends on, and those who own fewer slaves, again, didn't have the luxury to say, we're going to assign the 25 slaves I own, 15 to pick cotton, and the rest will do other tasks around the property. Slaves on large plantations usually worked in gangs, and they were headed by a slave driver. That was, again, someone who could be black, they could be white. They're chosen by the owner of the property, and many of these slave owners, again, this is in the rare cases of the high amount of slaves owned. They could hire a slave driver. They could hire an overseer who would conduct the day-to-day operations on the farm. So strength, intelligence, loyalty went into the selection of a slave driver. The driver assisted the overseer on different farms. The overseer could be black. The overseer could be white. The driver could be black or white. No rule. Certainly we know of the evidence that both existed. The strongest men who worked in the gang system were plowhands. Others were younger, less fit. Women became what they called hoe hands, working, again, the equipment needed and the tools needed to process the different crops. Everything was designed for profitability. Others were given jobs of weeding, clearing yards, sometimes sick slaves, elderly slaves, or pregnant slaves were put on other tasks that had to be done. Life on a large plantation was a sun-up until sundown process. Drivers would go out and send gangs into the fields for work. One of the best accounts we have of this taking place is Solomon Northup, again, the author of the book 12 Years a Slave. He says, during all these hoeings, the overseer or driver follows the slaves on horseback with a whip. The fastest hoer takes the lead row. He is usually about a rod in advance of his companions. If one of them passes him, he is whipped. If one falls behind or is a moment idle, he is whipped. Unquote. Small children are put to work as water carriers, or they would do light tasks around the property, often playing with kids who are white and our fellow slaves. Frederick Douglass talks about the fact he didn't realize he was a slave until late in his childhood, until he was picked up and separated and made to do work, unlike his white counterparts of those of his owners. Slaves too old or too feeble for field work took care of small children, maybe working in stables, given tasks that, again, were necessary to keep the farm or plantation going. Even more. And free labor systems, not meaning labor that's free, but meaning labor that is not enslaved. Slavery sought to achieve full employment. Slaves in the task system were encouraged to finish early, and if they did, depending on the overseer or driver or owner, there is no one rule to this, slaves can often use the rest of the day to do their own work. If tasks are at a minimum, they could devote some of their time to tending to their own small garden plots. Of course, they had cattle to tend to. They had to occasionally repair a fence, plant food, clear a forest, whatever that had to be done. Whatever the tasks were for that day, determined by the owner and the overseer and the driver, if you were on a larger plantation and farm that had the luxury of having an overseer and a driver. So obviously the size of the farm and the plantation dictated how work was divided. The larger land owners had the luxury of really training slaves in one task, just to be a blacksmith, just to be a carpenter, or work for the comfort of the master, whatever task had to be done. It begs the question, of course, and this is a great development of studying slavery over the past 40 and 50 years. Did any kind of slave hierarchy exist? It's a question we've asked for a number of years. Did skilled slaves look at themselves differently than field hands? Historians have stressed divisions and applied, I think, something of an unfair criteria. They designate slaves that were house slaves or were trained in a more elite status than common slaves. But then again, their masters did that, so maybe it's not the fault of historians. They kind of make that division based on what labor a slave would do. House servants, slaves who catered to the comfort of the master or ate, made the food, sometimes would eat and help dress the owner, they are often spared some of the more difficult labor tasks. And so it naturally makes us think that these are the so-called elite slaves on a farm or plantation. Of course, we look at it from a different point of view now because finally, thanks to things like the WPA narratives and different sources about slavery, slaves said, no, this isn't the case. Just because you don't do the worst tasks on the farm or plantation didn't mean you were held in the highest esteem. Being a house slave was not all it was cracked up to be in the order of slavery. How did slaves rank each other? We look at it from the outside looking in as mostly white authors of the history of slavery, and all of a sudden that perspective has changed. House servants are faced with a lot more supervision, and some slaves called it over-the-top galling supervision, and often lived very isolated from their fellow slaves, especially those who were field hands. One observer noted that, quote, slaves brought up to do housework dread to be employed at field labor, and those accustomed to the comparatively unconstrained life of the Negro settlement detest the close control and careful movements required of house servants, unquote. So there was more supervision, more watchful eyes. when you're talking about house servants. Again, in the rarefied air of those slave owners who owned enough slaves that they could dedicate some to being house slaves. One historian noted that most field slaves place house slaves at the bottom of the social hierarchy, reminding us, of course, that the white point of view, from those who write history, say giving slaves less laborious jobs place them higher. But that's not the case. To slaves, the high status goes to those who serve the slave community. So slaves held fellow slaves, fellow African Americans in the highest esteem who did jobs like being a minister or a doctor. One of the most trusted roles on a farm or plantation was to be a cook, because if you didn't perform up to the slave owner's standards, you can find yourself quickly thrown out, and then you would be a field hand or something else. It was also a dangerous job. I mean, if you tore these houses where they were large enough to have a separate kitchen, the kitchen was put aside so that if there was any kind of accident, the entire big house wouldn't burn down. Death for women was very high in slave populations. Childbirth, and right up there was death by fire and accidents that would happen. So the exception to the rule in this hierarchy, and the fact that we can talk about if a hierarchy even exists, are in slave holdings of 20 or more. For those under 20, there's no real system of any kind of hierarchy, either that was accepted or kind of thought of by white historians and even by African American slaves, who in their accounts said, no, what you all thought was the system where we kind of ordered slaves on the plantation, a hierarchy that existed and didn't exist the way you thought. So specialization can exist when there is larger slave holding in some of the larger areas of the plantations and other settings. What makes the slave status unique, the status that slaves are both subjects and objects, and again susceptible to this idea that we talked about, the theme of the class, the problem of slavery, is that they are both individuals and property. And during the antebellum period, we see more slave owners try to craft themselves as paternalistic. That's the relationship they had with, they sometimes say, their servants, their people. They didn't always use the word my slaves. They didn't do that all that much. So it's a way to kind of set a fiction that slavery was painless. It wasn't good, but it wasn't something where owners would inflict harm on purpose. It's a slavery in which masters took a lot of personal interest in the lives of their slaves. They know their names. Masters see slaves not just as laborers, but as people. They're inferior, no doubt. They're members of their extended household, and they expect work and obedience. But at the same time, this is the development of antebellum slavery, how it changes. They owed guidance and protection. In other words, there was a responsibility upon the slave owner to treat the slaves, which are, again, not equally human and property, nevertheless to treat them with some basic living standards. And so we see this shift. And while slaves are disposable, we can buy more, probably during the second and third and fourth generations of slaves, of Africans in the Americas. If you stay in Virginia and you become kind of the founding generation of the Chesapeake tobacco planters, starting in around the 1740s. I know this kind of predates our story, but it's when we begin to see the development of a Creole population of slaves, meaning that births outdistance deaths, and the population of slaves in, I would say, areas of Virginia and Maryland become self-sustaining. So it's hard to get into the mind of the owners. And we've been trying to, and the first stories and histories of slavery have been certainly from the owner's perspective. But you have to think about their overriding principle is to consider profit and income. That's their motivating force, which they often have to supplement with a desire for personal power. They also have to live in a community of other slave owners. And if you could control slaves and become profitable, you were thought of very highly by your colleagues. And those who were not slave owners, the 75% of Southerners didn't want to own slaves or didn't own slaves, they wanted to. Those that didn't wanted to move into the slave owning class. Those that were slave owners that owned 1 to 5 can find themselves very quickly in economic downturns, no longer part of the slave owning class. So we have references in diaries when we're considering profit and control. This is what's driving slave owners. References in diaries and sources of whites, both slave owning and non-slave owning whites, showing affection for slaves. In economic terms, the owners want to, at all times, you want to maximize your profit. You want to protect the value of your investment. This is a considerable amount of money to purchase another human being, to purchase a slave. So it makes sense to provide a very basic standard of living and to promote health and fertility. Slave owners were panicking in the time after the American Revolution. There was talk of cutting off the international slave trade. In 1808, the slave trade was cut off. And people thought, oh my gosh, how will we sustain slavery? And I think those that were slave owners never realized what was happening. Again, 200 years later, we realized that the population of African Americans in the United States, in especially the South, was growing almost as quickly as the white population, in spite of, obviously, poorer health care, in spite of horrible working conditions, malnutrition, exposure, not having all the comforts of being warm and having clothing. Nevertheless, the self-sustaining population of American slaves is what slave owners didn't know about. I mean, it was going to move into new areas and it was going to grow quickly. Not from, oh gosh, we have to make sure that we have a constant connection back to Africa and the Caribbean for slaves. So all these folks talking about the idea that just cutting off the slave trade and you'd end slavery, that was a pipe dream. It was a pipe dream. So the slave owners were motivated by this sense to promote health, to promote fertility, because your investment would get a great return if your slaves had children. Owners could wink, wink, nod, nod. Well, these two are legally not married, but they're having children, and I own those children. I can separate them anytime I want as well. I can sell part of the family. I can split up a so-called husband and wife. I can individually separate siblings. So I want them to have kids, but I own them, and I could do whatever I want. The whims and the economic choices I have to make, it's irrelevant of what that does to slave families. So kindness and humanity, again, these are terms that you don't really want to apply and throw out to talking about slavery, but it's what they used, slave owners. They use words that we show kindness, we show humanity. It never, of course, was a prerequisite that slaves would stay on farms. Look at the runaway ads. I have one here. I've studied runaway slave ads. I've studied them a lot in John Sibley. Yeah, John Sibley, Sibley Lake in Natchitoches, and the man who was, of course, an Indian agent here in the early 1800s. He owned a newspaper in North Carolina, and when the newspaper ran, one of the things that you see in John Sibley's Fayetteville, North Carolina newspaper is advertisements for runaway slaves. And it usually starts like this. From the subscriber near Clinton, Greene County, Alabama. My Negro boy named Fagans, who is heavy built, above 5 feet 8 or 10 inches high, near 35 years old, has a heavy black beard. They get into all of this detail, and they say things, obviously, to try to recover their slave. This is a runaway slave ad, and at the end you see that you'll be rewarded, and they sometimes list the reward, $5, $10, significant amount of money for any information about a runaway slave. But some of the other ads say things like, well, Cuffy, the name of my slave, was friendly and wanted to please. Again, it's literally the slave owner in the ad saying, I wonder why he or she ran away. Well, because they're enslaved. Maybe that has to do with it. There's a mistaken idea that a slave wouldn't run away or a slave would return because you were a so-called, in quotes, kindly or humanitarian slave owner. Of course, ignoring the fact that you were committing one of the biggest violations of humanity in human history by owning someone else. Sometimes owners would put in the ad that there would be an offer of forgiveness pending from the owner if the slave returned. Why? Well, some slaves read. They would probably come across this. Others, if sometimes slaves ran away to visit family, and this was an understood part of the system. You have a lot of accounts of slaves and slave owners saying things like, well, I know I had family over here. I left the farmer plantation where I worked and disappeared, came back a day or two later. And the owner would have to make a decision. Am I going to, again, publicly chastise this slave? Am I going to apply a lash? Am I going to do something, put the slave in the stocks for the day? Or am I going to say, look, they came back, so there's that. And it all depends on the whims of the individual slave owner. Owners expect gratitude for acts of kindness that they give to slaves, giving them Sunday off, an extra day for a particular holiday or celebration or a birthday. There's an indulgence sometimes by a slave owner. Restraint in applying a beating to a slave. If you can imagine, that's seen as an act of kindness or restraint. And the slaves should, of course, be loyal in the aftermath of that. So we can say about slavery, and this is a term that when you say it, you have to qualify it immediately. The care of slaves improved in the time before the Civil War, which you're talking about a system of slavery. You treated slaves better, or they were kindly slave owners. This is, again, these are loaded terms. But we're able to make that statement because we can compare it to what was happening during the colonial period. Now, life for everybody got better than in the colonial period. There was more of an abundance of food. You went from shelters and rudimentary housing to more permanent houses. There was, again, one of the things that happened in the American colonies to both white and black is you did not see a massive famine that you saw around the world. Frederick Douglass noted this. Quote, not to give a slave enough to eat is regarded as the most aggravated development of meanness, even among the slave holders, unquote. So there was food to go around and it was abundant. And to withhold food, again, this from the point of view of a slave who's written a narrative account. The standard ration for slaves, again, standard. This isn't one that everyone had to follow. This is an accepted, consistent statistic that we've seen. A standard ration was 8 quarts of cornmeal and 2.5 to 4 pounds of pork or bacon per week. It doesn't sound like a lot, and it isn't. It was often supplemented by numerous items according to the region where the slaves lived and that the slaves could find. They could go out and hunt. They could fish if they were allowed. Many owners allowed, this is obviously a row of slave quarters or slave cabins. They're often called the quarters. They're in the plantations and farms that have the ability to have separate slave quarters, and a lot of them. They would usually be put out of the way of the main house. A garden plot was allowed by masters so that fruit and animals could be obtained by slaves. They were probably given rations of sugar and coffee, maybe even whiskey, rarely, but as a way to, again, maybe buy off the slaves' obedience. If dietary deficiencies existed, and I'm sure they did, it's because antebellum medicine for everybody, white and black, remained in the Dark Ages. Most Southerners, whether they be white or black, consumed nutritionally unbalanced diets, ones that we would just say, oh, there's not enough of a certain, again, nutrient in the food. And the way they cooked food would just turn our stomachs today. Again, it wasn't prepared the same way, and oftentimes it was could not at all be refrigerated. Slaves' housing and clothing were generally crude but functional. It was encouraged by other slave owners to provide the basic multiple suit of clothes for slaves. Colonial slave owners usually left slaves to find shelters in barns, lofts, and outbuildings. But if you could afford it, and if you owned a number of slaves, you would build a slave cabin. They were, not always, but again, studying the architectural remains and actually cabins that still exist to this day on plantations and farms around the United States. They were about 16 by 18. Slave owners and overseers regularly inspected them, to no one's surprise, to make sure they stayed clean, to prevent sickness. Field hands received 4 coarse suits of clothes every year. A pants and shirt for men, dresses for women. They were either made on the premises, or sometimes they were made from imported cotton, which was often called, they gave a name for it, Negro cloth. So it was brown cotton that was used, wasn't as high quality and desired in making other clothing. And so it would have been bought inexpensively from northern textile mills. Of course, institution of slavery was national. The other thing that, kind of escapes the complete control of slave owners is that slaves practice their own faith. Owners become more and more interested in the slave religion also during the antebellum period. I think a lot of that had to do with the Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening, that happened in the 1830s and 40s. Slaves practiced what we would, I think, today call a selective Christianity, elements from Africa and the Caribbean, combined with their owners' multiple Christian faiths, that be Baptist, Lutheran, so on and so forth. Owners sometimes are hesitant, should we allow our slaves to practice our faith? And some say, well, it's probably a stabilizing force. Maybe it's actually a good thing. Slaves spurn a lot of the lectures and the sermons that they find in the Bible about obedience and authority. They'd rather look at other themes. And again, a selective Christianity. They favor the elements of Christianity, the religion of their owners, that celebrates the oppressed. Promises of deliverance that will happen from earthly troubles, either later in life or sometimes in the afterlife. It reminds us, of course, that as much as Stanley Elkins wanted to use the term the Sambo, or reduce slaves to childlike obedience, slaves are not robots. They form their own communities, they form their own culture, and try to keep as much of it intact as possible. They try to also keep it away from slave owners. Because the number of slaves coming into the United States slows to nearly nothing after 1808, Africans and African Americans become more removed from their ancestors, the same as whites in the South in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation. In addition, America's slaves have more diverse African tribal and ethnic origins than perhaps other areas. We talked about Louisiana. Now, the slaves essentially came from one part of West Africa. Obviously, all people from around the world went through this acculturation period, whites and blacks alike, and Southern slaves were no exception. They created their own culture, and it helped preserve, again, some of their crucial areas of life in the area of faith, families, marriage. Historians and economists, kind of the last question when we talk about slavery, because in the book it's clear that the American South is one of only a couple of slave regimes that still exist after 1850. One of the arguments historians like to have: would slavery have lasted beyond the time of emancipation? The South had certain advantages, maybe that would allow the institution to stay alive. There was still new land to develop. I mean, swaths of the South had not been settled. The second argument to say, well, slavery would have died a natural death, maybe, maybe not. The one that kind of allows it for its continuance is that slaves were producing commodities, products that foreign markets wanted. Cotton, tobacco, hemp, rice, sugarcane. These things were being exported to Europe, to England, and to Russia. And the third development is one we mentioned before. By natural increase, the number of slaves that could move into undeveloped areas and plant crops that other parts of the world wanted were also on the rise. It's a population that is self-sustaining. The other part of the story that we sometimes neglect to tell is that the North supports the system of slavery. Slave labor buys American products and fuels the national economy. Ships transport slaves from one southern port to another. They also pick up the products that slaves grow and make in different parts of the American South. Banks and insurance firms in the North invest in the system of slavery. It's all tied to moving the products grown by slave labor. And so it begs the question, could slavery have continued? Well, the returns were good enough. I mean, you can't, as a private individual, invest in a system where you lose money again and again and again. It will not be sustainable. Southerners knew the road to wealth was in land and owning slaves. Giving you an example, by 1840, the South grows 60% of the world's cotton, which is half. Cotton itself is half of all of American exports. Louisiana sugar, which is often lost in the story of antebellum slavery because it's all about talking about cotton and cotton. You know, you don't make war on cotton, as the one Southerner said. Cotton is king. Sugar planters were always looking for ways to improve sugar production by using new methods of technology. But what didn't change was the fact that they were going to use slaves to, of course, bring these crops in. The cotton press came out of Natchez. It's a way to transport more cotton and load more of it onto ships to leave the United States. Owners often diversified and said, well, if we can't have a good crop in cotton or sugarcane, we'll switch to something else, which is not really good in some ways for the development of the South. By 1850, we know that people might say cotton is king, but we also know that the South was having trouble feeding itself. Yeah, cash crops are fantastic, but, you can't eat cotton as part of a well-balanced meal. It's just not going to work. So that gives us a little insight into slavery as it did exist. Again, the perspective has changed. 100 years ago, you would have looked at slavery, and slaves would be basically faceless forces that worked on farms and plantations. It's changed dramatically, and that's good for scholarship and good to tell a more rich and inclusive story of American history. But having gotten a little bit of the background of the South and the mindset of the slave owners, the slave-holding class, this tells you a little bit about more of the intricate realities of slave ownership and the life of slaves on farms and plantations.